So as I said earlier, today almost feels like Christ the King Sunday. And honestly, I think it's very appropriate for this on this third Sunday in Advent, right? Because we have been in this season of preparation for 2 weeks now. I mean, longer if you started decorating the day after Halloween, like some of my neighbors have, right? And this is all the more important this time of year, where as I've heard this week, the secular and religious calendars are still somewhat intertwined, right? Some of the dearly loved Christmas songs that are played on the radio have religious overtones, and people are seeing nativities and Christmas plays like the one we had in between our services. And with all this focus on the baby Jesus, it is good to ask who we actually are waiting for, because it can be easy to get caught up in this season that we miss the deeper point and the reason for Advent and focusing on his second coming. Right? And jumping to the end of the gospel lesson really quick, this is kind of what Jesus is asking the people that came out. Like, what did you go out in the wilderness to look for? Right? Using images and illustrations of King Herod and royalty, right? Were they expecting to go out into the wilderness to see a continuation of the world as it is, with royalty walking around in soft robes in their summer palaces? Well, no. They were expecting something different. And that something different was the one who was preparing the way for something different. So what are we expecting? Right? Because John spent his entire adult life preparing the way for the Messiah. And last week we got a glimpse into how he prepared. Right? John was convinced that the Messiah would come and clean house. He would pick up the axe that's at the root of the trees and cut down all those who weren't producing good fruit. He would use the winnowing fork and divide the wheat from the chaff, putting the wheat in the granary and the chaff and burning it with unquenchable fire. To say the least, when the Messiah came, John was convinced that there would be wrath. Heads would roll. He even said so when he talked to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When he said, "Who warned you to flee from the wrath that is to come?" And with the words unquenchable fire still ringing out in the wilderness, that's when Jesus stepped out onto the scene and was baptized by John in the River Jordan. And in that instant, John got to see his entire life's work seemingly come to fulfillment and conclusion. Right? The Messiah had finally arrived. And so everyone, including religious and political leaders, better watch out. And John was not alone in this expectation. Right? Many people in the first century Judaism expected the Messiah to come, and regardless of how they did it and what it looked like, the Messiah would bring an era of peace. But usually that meant bringing the mighty down first. But now, some months later, John is sitting in prison. And he's gotten word of what Jesus has been doing. But he's not seeing heads rolling and wrath being dished out. Quite frankly, the world has not changed one bit. And if you actually know what happens to John in John's story, he will soon become yet another example about how the rich and the powerful devalue human life and still continue to get away with murder. So, as he's sitting there in prison, has he been wrong about Jesus being the Messiah? Did his work come to fruition, or was it all for naught? So John sends some of his disciples to ask Jesus quite plainly, "Are you the one, or are we to wait for another? Are you the one I spent my life preparing the way for? Are you the one who's going to bring God's kingdom to earth, or was I wrong about you?" which is why I say this reading seems more like Christ the King Sunday than a week and a half before Christmas. Because I think this is where a lot of people find themselves in this season. Like John, stuck in a world that we seem helpless to change. Tired that things are looking all too much the same. In a world that is where there's far too much mourning and crying and pain than there should be. So we begin to question, even start looking in other places or expecting other things. In this time of year, that feeling gets magnified. And all across the country, depression increases. Counseling requests increase. Conversations with pastors increase. Admissions into care and rehab facilities rise, and even suicide attempts peak. As we are approaching the longest night of the year, we need to recognize that there are still people who dwell in deep darkness. And not just in this season, but almost as a matter of course. And so for this very reason, it's one of the reasons why we have the longest night service on Friday. In order to provide a space for people to grieve and to name that disappointment and to hear God's presence with them. Right? For people to name their grief and feelings and offer them to God. So when we look at all of this, we look at what's going on, we got to ask ourselves, right? Are heads rolling and axe chopping and wrath really what we need first? Because if that happens, there is still many who will continue to walk in darkness. So instead of determining for ourselves what an act of God will look like that would make the world better, maybe we should listen to Jesus. And Jesus responds to John. Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. You see, while John and others wait for judgment, Jesus brings healing. While John and others wait for upheaval, Jesus brings nearness. While John and others wait for God to fix the world from the top down, Jesus shows up from the bottom up. One act of love and one moment of presence to the people who need it the most. So it may not be the Jesus John wanted. I think it's the Jesus we need. Who sometimes doesn't live up to our expectations, who doesn't make heads roll or shake up the powers that be, but instead dwells with us, willingly enters into the dark places of our lives and walks with us. So maybe we are called to let Jesus speak for himself instead of making him in our own image of what Christ the King will look like. Which might be why we have this odd gospel reading a week and a half before Christmas. Maybe in this season of darkness, we need to be reminded that in Matthew's gospel, the gospel that we're going to hear a lot from this coming year, that Jesus is first and foremost Emmanuel, God with us. That in our darkness, God is not absent, but actually enters in, so that we might rejoice even in times and days of darkness, because we have a God who knows our pain and our disappointment and stays with us. And in fact, comes even closer to us than we can imagine. Like in communion or in the waters of baptism. And if his first advent brought this foretaste, his second advent will bring its fulfillment. So the question before us and before John, now that you know that this is how God's kingdom will come and what it will look like, is how is it going to change your preparation? now that we know who we're waiting for, the question shifts not when will God act, but how will we prepare for this one to come? Right? Maybe this week, preparing looks like choosing presence over answers, but staying with someone who is hurting instead of trying to fix them. Maybe it looks like letting the darkness be named, right? Showing up on our longest night service, lighting a candle at home, allowing the light to kind of break in. Or maybe finally telling God the truth about what hurts. Or maybe, like the Christmas gifts that we're going to be handing out today, or the WFC boxes we've been packing, it looks like becoming a small sign of that kingdom yourself. Being and bringing good news to someone who feels forgotten. Helping someone walk a little easier by carrying their burden, poking one hole in the darkness that they're surrounded by. Because this is who we're waiting for. And this is how the waiting begins. Not with cheer we don't feel, but with hope made tangible that shows up for one life with one act of love and one moment of presence at a time. Amen.